Welcome to the Odyssey Introduction Notes. The Odyssey, as told by Homer, and your textbook version that we will be reading, which is abridged from the Odyssey, is translated by Robert Fitzgerald. All right, so what is this story, the Odyssey? Well, it was originally told by Homer, as I just said, and the translation is by Robert Fitzgerald. And the Odyssey is a sequel to the Iliad. And so the Iliad is the book that comes first before the Odyssey. And the Iliad focuses on the days toward the end of the Trojan War, which would have been about mid-1200s BC. And then the Odyssey focuses on one of the soldiers who fought in the Trojan War, returning home 19 years after the war. And his name is Odysseus. Now, some scholars round this up to 20 years. So he fought for 10 years in the Trojan War, and then it took him about another 10 to get home. The Iliad and the Odyssey together were considered very sacred to the Greeks, much like the Bible to many people today. So, for example, instead of having a textbook in class, students may have learned from the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so the Iliad really focuses on, the days towards the end of the Trojan War, but it also focuses on fate and how much faith and hope that we have within ourselves, within our religion. And it also features Achilles, which you may have seen from the movie Troy. I'll talk about that shortly. And so the Odyssey focuses on one man's journey home from war and how we cope with that. And so neither books were originally written down. They were both originally recited orally. So it's a lot like stories that we have today. They are told and they're passed down, and then somebody eventually writes it down. So let's talk about the Trojan War. So the Spartan king Menelaus' wife Helen, you may have heard her name before. She is known as the face that launched 1,000 ships, left him for the young prince of Troy. So Helen left her husband, King Menelaus, for the young prince of Troy. It's a really long story, but you may have heard of Helen of Troy. And the gods and goddesses got involved when they went to Paris, and they asked him which one was the fairest of them all, talking about Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. And of course, you don't want to ask a goddess like which of you are the fairest, because they're all going to believe that they are the best. And so they decided to go to ask Paris this, and they all bribed Paris with different offers. And of course, Aphrodite bribed him with the most beautiful woman in the world, which happened to be Helen, and she happened to be married to the Spartan king. So there are several different versions that Helen was kidnapped for Paris, or Helen automatically fell in love with Paris. Again, there are different versions. If you've ever seen the movie Troy, which we will not have time to watch in class, but I highly recommend that you watch it. It will help preface the Odyssey for you guys. So again, the Greeks attacked Troy because King Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon, and he said, "Yo, bro, can you help me out? This dude stole my wife. Okay, I got to get her back." And Agamemnon agreed. And so they led this war, and they attacked Troy. And so Odysseus, he is the main character of the Odyssey. He is definitely a war hero in the Trojan War. We don't hear a lot about him in the Trojan War, but we hear more about him in the Odyssey. And so Odysseus was known not only for being a strong hero, but also being a wise and a smart hero. He had what we would call a good battle strategy, and he would think out his plan. So, of course, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and battle strategy and warfare, she helped Odysseus out a lot. And so there is also another hero, Achilles, who died in the final year of the war, which is played by Brad Pitt himself right here in the movie Troy. So again, if you have time, watch the movie Troy. It will be worth it. The Greek forces were very victorious, and they won this war. So let's talk a little bit more about Odysseus, since you have a preface of the Trojan War. Odysseus, he is our main character and hero of the Odyssey. His wife's name is Penelope. His son's name is Telemachus, and yes, I'm butchering that name with my southern accent. He is a great soldier of the war, Odysseus is. He originally tried to get out of going to the war and pretended he was crazy. So remember, I said King Agamemnon and King Menelaus, they were trying to gather men to help fight in the war, and they knew Achilles and Odysseus were two of the best fighters. So, of course, they want their help. They went to Odysseus, and they said, hey, Odysseus, we need you to fight in this war. Well, Odysseus and Penelope had just had Telemachus. He was a newborn, and Odysseus did not want to leave his son or his wife, who he loved so very much. And he pretended to go crazy, and he pretended that he was insane to get out of going to the war. And so this actually kind of backfired on him, because Agamemnon and Menelaus knew he was pretty wise and smart. And so they said, okay, Odysseus, if you are crazy, then you will. And they took Telemachus as a newborn and laid him in a field. And they said, you will run over your son with this mule plow if you were that crazy. And of course, Odysseus could not injure his son in any way. And so they called Odysseus's bluff on it, and then he had to fight in the war. So Odysseus, you may have seen this wooden horse for the Battle of Troy and the Trojan War, and Helen of Troy. And so Odysseus is the one who came up with the wooden horse trick that led to Troy's collapse. And so the Odyssey starts after the Trojan War, and it's the account of Odysseus' journey home after the war. And so here's an example of what the Trojan horse would have looked like. These are definitely replicas of what the Trojan horse could have looked like. But Odysseus and his men, they held themselves up in the middle of this, and they hid. And then when the Trojans thought that they were victorious, they thought it was a gift from the Spartans. And so the Trojans wheeled it inside and had a really big celebration, thinking they won the war. And then after they were done partying, they passed out. And then, of course, Odysseus and his men thought that was the best time to strike. And then they ended up escaping out of the horse and killing all of the Trojan soldiers. And it was just a very, very bloody battle. And all of it started over a girl named Helen. So be careful out there. All right, next is Odysseus' journey. So according to Google Maps, Odysseus starts his journey from Troy here, and he should go to Ithaca right here, his hometown. According to Google Maps, as I was about to say a second ago, it should have taken him maybe 2 weeks to get home, but instead it takes him 10 years, and he just has a lot of obstacles in his way. And one reason is because we have the hero's journey present in this. Like, he really is tested, and he battles all of these monsters, these temptresses, these witches. And so it really is the story of how a man has to come home from war and also cope after war. Because poor Odysseus, he really he struggles with how to cope with life after war. He even has PTSD and wakes up in night terrors and screams. So yeah. All right, moving on to Homer. Homer, and I'm not talking about Homer Simpson. I'm talking about Homer, the Rhapsody. He is the singer of tales. He was a minstrel singer from the island Chios, and he was blind. So he was very creative with his descriptions, and you have to be, if you're trying to describe something vividly to someone who is blind. So Homer was very good at telling this tale of Odysseus, and a lot of people told the tale of the Odyssey. And it just so happens that Homer was the best at it, and we actually give him credit for telling the story of the Odyssey. So they wrote all of Homer's facts down, and we say the Odyssey is as told by Homer. All right, so what is an epic? Well, the Odyssey is an epic, and you will also read another epic later in your high school education, hopefully. In World Lit, you will read Beowulf, which is another great epic. But this epic, particularly, is a good one to start off with because it has a lot of the traits that we'll be looking for while we are reading for the epic hero traits. And so an epic is a long narrative poem. So it's written in a poem-like structure. And before you roll your eyes, it's not going to be as torturous as you think. But it tells about the adventures of a hero and, usually embodies the values of cultures for which they are written, The Iliad and the Odyssey were used in schools to teach Greek virtues. So again, the Iliad and the Odyssey were used as textbooks in schools. And so it taught students different values that you should have, such as honor, bravery, hospitality, intelligence, respect for the gods, loyalty to home and family. And it also taught these students major faults, like what not to do, especially disrespect for the gods. Do not disrespect the gods. Do not have a lack of hospitality. And this hubris, which I have this spelled wrong. Let me fix this. It is, in fact, hubris, which means excessive pride. All right, and so our main character, Odysseus here, he is truly guilty of this Greek term hubris. He has all this excessive pride, and his excessive pride really does him in, and especially his men in. Like, if there's one thing about Odysseus, is you probably don't want to be Odysseus's friend, just because he may have good intentions, but his excessive pride is probably going to get in the way of a life or death situation. And so again, the Iliad is the primary model for the epic of war, and then the Odyssey is the primary model for the epic of a long journey. And you may have heard the term epic before in pop culture. So, for example, someone may have said, "Oh, bro, that was an epic fight." Okay, that means it's like out of this world, extreme. But it also is applied to novels, dramas, and films, which are grand in the scale of their action or importance of their subject matter, which is just bottom line what epic means. It just means it's grand. Okay, it's off the chain. And epics always have important themes and heroes in them. The characteristics of an epic are that they are a long narrative poem, they relate to the deeds of an epic hero, they incorporate myth, legend, folktale, and history, they reflect the values of the society from which they originate. The tone is usually grand, which is why you'll ask yourself, well, how can Odysseus pick that boulder up and throw it, or how can he do X, Y, Z? Well, it's because the tone is grand in the scheme of things, and also he's an epic hero. The heroes and adventures are going to appear larger than life as well. Some more characteristics of an epic. This is super important. This Greek term, in media res, it's Latin for it begins in the middle of things, and then it flashes back to explain the action leading up to that point. We see this a lot in movies. Some really good examples that I can think of would be Forrest Gump, when he's sitting on the bench and he's talking, and you're kind of like, well, how did he get there? And then he starts all the way from the beginning. Another good example of this would be from one of my favorites is Deadpool, when the movie comes on and everybody's suspended in air. And here, I think Deadpool's talking about, you're probably wondering how I got here in this situation. And so he kind of takes you all the way back to the beginning up into that point where he is suspended in air. So that's what in media res means. It means in the middle of. This is when the story starts in the middle of everything, and then you have to kind of figure out what happened beforehand. And epics always begin with an invocation or a prayer to a god or gods. And so this would be like, sometimes athletes, they'll say a prayer before their performance or their game or their match. And so this would be like a prayer. A lot of these storytellers would pray to the muses, who were going to be some of the daughters of Zeus, of the arts and the poetry. And so there's a muse of epic poetry, and so she would have been the one that Homer would have prayed to. Epics always begin with a statement of theme. They contain many epithets. Epithets are basically nicknames. So, for example, Poseidon, his nickname is the Earth Shaker. And they contain long formal speeches by many, many characters. And it frequently has epic digressions. So I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, well, that escalated quickly. Well, it really can escalate quickly in an epic. And you may ask yourself, well, how did this happen so quickly? And then a character was at an all-time low, and then they reached an all-time high. Well, that's just an epic digression. Next are the characteristics of an epic hero. So first, an epic hero is going to be superhuman. And during a quest, they're going to go through trials and tribulations in order to achieve a goal or quest or a task. Villains are also going to try to keep the hero from his quest. He has a tragic flaw. Epic heroes are of a mixed divine and human birth. And an epic hero is on a quest for something of great value. So, for example, Odysseus in the Odyssey, he is on a quest for home, which is of great value to him. Now, some other epic hero traits that I don't have listed on here that you may want to write down is loyalty to home, loyalty to family, loyalty to crew, intelligence or wisdom, bravery, and strength. All right, so those are some that you need to pay attention to as well because I think they are important. All right, next are epic literary terms, which if you're filling in your note sheet, these are not in order. So they're all in random scrambled order. So you'll have to kind of follow along as I go. But the epic is a long narrative poem about the deeds of an epic hero. An epic hero is going to be the central figure of the epic. The epic simile and Homeric simile is basically an elaborate comparison of unlike subjects. So if you know what a simile is, which is comparing two objects using like or as, when you think of a simile and you add the word epic or Homeric to it to make it an epic or Homeric simile, I want you to think of it as a simile on steroids. So, for example, Homer, he would give you something familiar that you know, and he would compare it to something that you would be totally unfamiliar with to make you understand what he's talking about. And so that is what an epic or Homeric simile is. Next is a tragic flaw, which most characters have. It's going to be a weakness in the hero's character. Again, Odysseus, his hubris, his excessive pride is his tragic flaw. Next is symbolism. This is the frequent use of words, places, characters, or subjects that mean something beyond what they are on a literal level. And lastly is irony. This indicates that a character or plot development of an intention or attitude is actually opposite to what is actually stated. So something happens and then the opposite is stated or occurs. And then lastly, imagery. That's going to be mental pictures. I just always say, close your eyes and envision it. If I can describe it for you, it's probably got imagery in it. It often appeals to the senses, and Homer is really good with that as well when he tells his story. Next is foreshadowing, hints of future events in a piece of literature. Flashback is a writer's technique in which the author interrupts the plot of the story to recreate an incident of an earlier time, so they go back in time, like giving the reader a memory. And flashbacks are very popular, especially when a story starts in media res, which is your next term. So when a story starts in the middle of everything, obviously a character is going to have to flash back and tell you what happened up until that event. And so that's why flashbacks and in media res, they kind of go hand in hand together like that. But in media res is your last term, and it is a classical tradition of opening an epic, not in the chronological point at which the sequence of events would start, but rather at the midway point of the story. So if you're taking notes, you just write in media res equals in the middle of, okay? And so the Greeks came up with this way of storytelling, and it helped keep the listeners and the audience on the edge of their seats. So we can thank the Greeks for a lot of our plot structures of in media res. And that concludes the Odyssey introduction notes.